Okay, we're back and we're going to be finishing chapter 4 of Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology. Chapter 4 again is on the topic of the immolated kings. We are in section 3, the king and the virgin of the Vestal fire. The gruesome original sense of the relationship of the Vestal virgin Sali's role, as well as of Shahrazad's in the Arabian Nights, to the archaic regicide comes out cruelly the moment we focus on the royal rituals traditionally practiced until recently in the Sudan. Among the Shilluk, the priests who were the only ones knowing the will of God, whom they called Nyakang, saw to it that the king was killed after a term of 7 years, or if the crops or prosperity of the herds failed before that term, even earlier. The person of the king was sacred and could be seen by none but the nobles. Not even his children could enter his dwelling, and when he stepped forth, surrounded closely by the nobles, criers sent the people flying to their huts. When the time arrived for his death, the high priest told the paramount noble, and the latter then assembled the members of his own class and appraised them, in silence, by a motion of his hand. The mystery had to be consummated on one of the dark nights that fall between the last and the first quarters of the moon, in the dry period before the first rain, and before the first seeds were sown. The charge was executed by the chief noble himself. None other should hear of it, know or speak of it, and there should be no weeping. The king was strangled and buried with a living virgin at his side, and when the two bodies had rotted, their bones were gathered into the hide of a bull. A year later the new king was named, and on his predecessor's grave cattle were speared to death by the hundred. Of old, such customs were known to many peoples not only of the Upper Nile, but of other parts of the Sudan as well, also in Mozambique, Angola, and Rhodesia. India and Indonesia too knew the rites. In fact, the most vivid example on record of an immolation of the sacred king is probably that in Duarte Barbosa's description of the coasts of East Africa and Malabar in the beginning of the 16th century. The god-king of the South Indian province of Kilakari in Malabar, an area having a strongly matriarchal tradition to this day, had to sacrifice himself at the end of the length of time required by the planet Jupiter for a circuit of the zodiac and return to its moment of retrograde motion in the sign of Cancer, which is to say 12 years. When his time came, the king had a wooden scaffolding constructed and spread over with hangings of silk. And when he had ritually bathed in a tank, with great ceremonies and to the sound of music, he proceeded to the temple where he paid worship to the divinity. Then he mounted the scaffolding, and before the people took some very sharp knives and began to cut off parts of his body, nose, ears, lips, and all his members, and as much of his flesh as he was able, throwing them away and round about until so much of his blood was spilled that he began to faint, whereupon he slit his throat. This essential motif lies in the timing of the death of the god, writes Frobenius in his summary discussion of the archetype of the sacral regicide. The great god must die, forfeit his life, and be shut up in the underworld within the mountain. The goddess, and let us call her Ishtar, using her later Babylonian title, follows him into the underworld, and after the consummation of his self-immolation releases him. The supreme mystery was celebrated not only in renowned songs, but also in the ancient New Year festivals. where it was presented dramatically and this dramatic presentation can be said to represent the acme of the manifestation of the grammar and logic of mythology in the history of the world. The whole idea was realized furthermore in a corresponding organization of the social institutions, the best preserved vestiges and echoes of which are to be found in Africa. Indeed, the ideas have been found preserved to this day in act in the southern African Eritrean zone, Mozambique, Angola, and Rhodesia. There the king representing the great godhead even bore the name Moon, while his second wife was the moon's beloved, the planet Venus. And when the time arrived for the death of the god, the king and his Venus spouse were strangled, and their remains placed in a burial cave in a mountain, from which they were supposed then to be resurrected as the new or renewed heavenly spheres. And this surely must represent the earliest form of the mythological and ritual context. Already in ancient Babylon, it had been weakened, inasmuch as the king at the New Year festival in the temple was only stripped of his garments, humiliated and struck, while in the marketplace a substitute, who had been ceremonially installed in all glory, was delivered to death by the noose. It now seems clear, Frobenius then suggests, that this constellation of ideas and customs sprang from the region between the Caspian Sea and Persian Gulf, and spread thence southeastward into India and the Dravidian culture sphere, as well as southwestward across South Arabia and into East Africa. There is reason to believe, therefore, that the tales both of the king's sister in death, Sali, and of Scheherazade, the king's bride, who was to have died on her wedding night, must be echoes of a dim, dark past that was, after all, neither so dim nor dark in the memory of the world in which the tales were told. And we must regard it as likely, too, that whenever a king subordinate to a council of priestly dictators of the kingly destiny is found at the head of an apparently primitive tribe, the culture in question cannot be primitive exactly, but rather regressed. Its idea of correcting, in Plato's words quoted earlier, those circuits in the head that were deranged at birth by learning to know the harmonies and revolutions of the world, and thereby winning the best in life set by the gods before mankind, both for this present time and for the life to come, must have been derived ultimately from that high center of the idea of the hieratic city-state that we considered at the conclusion of our last chapter. Yet there is a deeper level of ritual human sacrifice to be considered, associated not with kings and the heavens, but with simple villagers and their food plants in the far-reaching culture province of the tropical gardens. And this may indeed be primitive. Before descending into that stratum, however, let us pause to attend the ritual of the kindling of the new fire, to which the Vestal Virgin Sali had been assigned. A comparison of the rites of the numerous African tribes among whom the mystery has been lately practiced or recalled, for example, the Mundang, Hausa, Gwari, Nupe, and Mossi of the Sudan, Yoruba of Nigeria, and in the south, the Rwanda, Wasegu, Wadu, Wawemba, Walumbwe, Wahemba, Mambwe, Lunda, Kanioka, Bangala, and Bihi, reveals that when the king was dead, all the fires in his domain were extinguished, and that during the period of no rule between his death and the installation of his successor, there was no holy fire. The latter was ritually rekindled by a designated pubescent boy and virgin, who were required to appear completely naked before the new king, the court, and the people with their fire sticks, the two sticks being known respectively as the male, the twirling stick, and the female, the base. The two young people had to make the new fire and then perform that other symbolically analogous act, their first copulation, after which they were tossed into a prepared trench, while a shout went up to drown their cries, and quickly buried alive. We are entering indeed the realm of King Death, the great chief Death. So that ends chapter 4. Thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed the stories of the immolated kings. Next time we'll start chapter 5, entitled The Ritual Love Death. Enjoy your day.